Welcome to Chapter 9 of Understanding Human Development. We're talking about personality and socio-cultural development in middle childhood. In this lesson, we're going to look at the developmental trends in self-esteem and self-concept during middle childhood. We're going to apply psychological models of development of social reasoning in middle childhood. We're also going to look at cognitive developments and how they influence peer groups in middle childhood. And we're also going to look at the formation of identity. In particular, we're also going to look at ethnic identity and things like that. We're also going to look at parent-child interactions and the context of child development within a family setting. So culture plays an important role in middle childhood, especially more so than early childhood, because in the early childhood, as we've seen, it was more the context was more about the immediate family. However, as children get older, they start to go into school and they start to broaden their social context. And that's why culture becomes even more important. So emotional and social attachments, like I said, shift primarily from the family to a larger group. And social cognition is of essential importance in understanding how children of grade school age develop. And children's thoughts and social understandings increasingly mediate their behavior, and their methods of coping help determine their personalities. We're going to talk about these a little more in depth. So first of all, you need to be able to differentiate the developmental trends in self-esteem and self-concept during middle childhood. What's the difference between self-esteem and self-concept? Well, self-esteem is more about how you how you see yourself in a positive or negative light, whereas self-concept is how you see yourself because of the way other people see you. Let's take three major theoretical perspectives on middle childhood. That is the social learning view, and then the psychodynamic view, and the cognitive development view. The social learning view looks at it through in terms of observational learning and behavioral learning in the context of society and how society reinforces our view of ourselves. Then there's a psychodynamic view, particularly as expanded on by the neo-Freudians like Erik Erikson, which we're going to look at. Erik Erikson talked about these psychosocial tasks or development throughout life, and we're going to look at that, especially in regards to middle childhood. And then we're also going to look at the cognitive development view. Cognitive development view looks at social cognitions in particular here. All right. So first of all, what is self-concept? Self-concept interweaves personality and social behavior. And so self-concept develops more in middle childhood. They start to have a more realistic sense of themselves and more accurate understanding of their skills and limitations. Whereas before, maybe they thought they could do anything if they wanted to, but now they start to know, no, they can't do everything. They also frequently compare themselves with their peers, and that's how they draw conclusions about themselves. Okay, so Erik Erikson, as you recall, who is a neo-Freudian or in the psychodynamic tradition, recognized how children define themselves compared to others and how this is a critical aspect of their development. So in middle childhood, the stage that's associated with this is industry versus inferiority. In Erikson's theory, this is the third stage of development, and this is a stage in which the child attempts to establish a sense of personal competence and mastery. This is after all the other things like having a sense of trust, and then autonomy, and then taking initiative. And then once they're able to take initiative, now they can actually be industrious. And children who succeed in school incorporate a sense of industry into their self-image. Children who don't progress toward academic success oftentimes feel inferior. So like I said, this is a stage in which they attempt to resolve the crisis of industry versus inferiority, and the child attempts to establish a sense of personal competence and mastery. In industrialized nations that emphasize educational attainment, like the United States, industry is often associated with the acquisition of new knowledge and skills. If they're not able to develop those skills, then they may feel inferior. Let's talk about self-esteem. Self-esteem is one's attitude towards oneself, which can range from positive like high self-esteem, to negative, like low self-esteem. And there's different variables that can include, there's different variables that can influence your self-concept. Self-concept meaning culture and your context. Whereas the development of self-esteem is a reciprocal process. The way we view ourselves oftentimes leads to how other people see us as well. So personal successes or failures can lead children to see themselves as winners or losers, which reinforces their position in society as winners or losers. And so has important long-term effects as well. So in cultures where formal education is expected, there's a significant correlation between self-esteem and academic achievement or achievement in other activities such as sports or music. So, like I said, if you think positively about yourself, you're going to succeed in academics or other areas. Positive self-esteem is also linked to being viewed positively by others, like in your family, peers, and others. So it's reciprocal. The way we view ourselves is oftentimes because of how others see us, but the way we view ourselves then contributes to our success in life and how other people view us. So there are some ways we can encourage self-esteem. Parents can positively influence their children's self-esteem by offering realistic praise and by encouraging them toward activities in which they can be successful. You want it to be realistic, because if for example, you put a lot of excessive praise on their children, then they might set themselves up for having high expectations that are unrealistic to maintain. And so if for some reason they're not able to maintain something, then they might feel bad about themselves. So it's important to provide realistic expectations for them too, so they don't have to feel bad if they're not always able to live up to it. Excessive or unrealistic praise often leads to negative outcomes. So it's interesting. You think that, praising them too much, we might think that would be a good thing, but it can also be bad, especially if it leads to unrealistic expectations for themselves that they have to maintain. The reality is that, we all make mistakes, and that's a normal part of development. We can't always be perfect. So let's talk about social knowledge. Social knowledge and reasoning is about how we develop a sense of the world around us, and it comes through our interaction with other people. And so we're going to look at psychological models and apply them to the development of social reasoning in middle childhood. There's many factors that can contribute to a child's developing sense of self. As we talked about, so we talked about self-concept and self-esteem, but now we need to understand how do people develop that. And cognition is of particular importance. And so even when I'm working with adults as a therapist, if I know that somebody has a poor self-concept or self-esteem, then I want to look at what kind of cognitions do they have about themselves. And then we want to understand, where did they get these cognitions from? And not just cognitions about themselves, but how they operate in the world. And are these beliefs realistic and normal? And so the middle childhood is a period of important cognitive advances, and children move from pre-operational period to concrete operations. So this is, like I said, is an important period of cognitive development. And so if they develop poor or unhealthy cognitions about how to relate to others, that can create poor self-esteem. In early childhood, egocentrism is pretty predominant, but it limits a child's understanding of the world because they're focused on themselves. That's a normal part of their development for early childhood. But social cognition is the thoughts, knowledge, and understanding that involves the social world that continues to develop. And so in middle childhood, they become better in dealing with complex social situations and making correct social inferences, which an inference is an individual's guesses and assumptions about what another person is feeling, thinking, or intending. And this is also termed as social perspective taking. This is important for developing empathy, but also helps children to understand how to deal with and live with the world. So in middle childhood, children must learn how to deal with the complexities of friendship and justice. They must understand social rules and manners, gender role conventions, obeying authority, and moral laws, moral principles. So there are three aspects of social cognition. As I mentioned, there's social inferences, which are an individual's guesses or assumptions about what other people are thinking. So we practice taking on the perspective of others. That's inferences. Then they also assume more social responsibility, an individual's obligations to family, friends, and society. This also plays a role in social cognition. And lastly, they also learn social regulations, and these reflect the rules, customs, and conventions that govern their culture's social interactions. So, and this is going to vary from culture to culture because every culture has different social regulations. So, in this diagram, we can see how all of these three things play a role. Social inferences ask the questions: what are the other person's feelings, thoughts, and intentions? Then, social responsibility asks the question: what are the responsibilities of a child like me to show fairness, respect, caring, and my other values to my family, friends, people in authority, young children, and others? And also, social regulations. These ask questions of what are the rules, customs, and expectations about gender, peer group, family, religion, school, and community authorities that I must apply to make my way in the social world. And all of these ultimately affect our social cognition, which answers the question, how do I understand the social world around me and around me and myself within it? And so if we think about it, these are how we understand other people, our responsibilities, and the expectations of us. So social cognition is a complex concept that includes a child's understanding of the social inferences, social responsibilities, and social regulations. All three of the above, all of these things, contribute to the child's ability to make moral judgments. That leads us to the next subject of the development of morality. According to Piaget, children's sense of morality, which is a person's ideas about fairness, justice, and right and wrong, all arises through the interaction of their developing cognitive structures and their widening social experiences. So as they develop their cognitions and they interact with others, they start to develop their sense of morality. Social learning theories, and again, we can look at these through the three different main psychological paradigms. So social learning theory is a subset of behaviorism that looks at how people learn things through observational learning. So social learning theorists would emphasize that morality is developed through the um, conditioning and observational learning. So they emphasize the roles conditioning and observational learning play in the development of morality. So it's a behavioral perspective, but it looks at things so through observational learning, which is a subset of behaviorism, social learning. The second psychological paradigm of morality would be psychodynamic theory. And they suggest that morality develops as we learn to cope with anxiety, guilt, and shame. And so, for example, we're going to look at that according to like Piaget, and others. Um, and then there is cognitive development theory, and that looks at how morality develops in progressive, age-related stages. And because as a child gets older, their cognition start to be deepen and become more accurate. So, as I mentioned, according to Piaget, children's sense of morality arises through their interaction of their developing cognitive structures and their widening social experiences. That was the Piaget's cognitive development perspective. So Piaget is the cognitive development theory, and Erickson would talk more about the psychodynamic theory, just to be correct about that. So Piaget, who is in the cognitive development camp, he developed two main stages of moral development. The first stage is the moral realism stage. This first stage emerges in early middle childhood. And in this basically says that all rules must be obeyed as if it's written in stone, Rules are real and indestructible, not abstract principles. And the morality of an act is judged by its consequences. If you think about it more, I mean, if you look at it, this would be they determine something if something is moral or not is if they violated a rule or not. Basically, so it's moral realism. Whereas moral relativism is about how these are based more on principles, and these emerge toward the end of middle childhood. They understand that rules are created and agreed upon cooperatively. That's why the moral relativism is an autonomous morality. It's also known as autonomous morality, which I'll come back to in a second. And moral relativism, they start to begin to realize that there's no absolute right or wrong. That depends a lot on the intentions of somebody's intentions. So in moral realism, it's known as heteronomous morality. It's called heteronomous because if you break down the word heteronomous, nomos means law, and hetero means other. So basically means these are other people's rules. That's why it's known as heteronomous morality. Whereas moral relativism is known as autonomous morality because it's my rules. I've adopted it as my own. I've internalized these, and yet we negotiate these kinds of rules. We come to understand that it's more about a social negotiation, and we have to cooperate with them. And yet we also we also play a role in determining whether something is right or wrong. So in moral relativism, this is in which children realize that rules are created and agreed upon cooperatively by individuals, and that they can be changed if necessary. That's moral relativism. Kohlberg took this and deepened it more in depth and created 6 stages of moral development. And so he developed a theory that specified 3 levels with 2 substages each for a total of 6 stages in the development of moral reasoning. We'll just talk about the main overall levels. The first level is the pre-conventional level. And this doesn't actually correspond to Piaget's. It would come before Piaget's moral realism. And this is before they understand. Well, this is I guess you could say this is similar to the beginning of moral realism in the sense that they understand there are rules, but they only follow them as a way to avoid punishment and to obtain rewards. So there is a behavioral perspective here that it's all based on punishments and rewards, and that's how children learn about morality. So this is really not so much. It's called pre-conventional because it's really not about morality. It's more about behavioral conditioning. And that's the motivation for moral behavior. It's really just about avoiding punishment and obtaining rewards. Now, level 2, which is more about, which is called conventional, the conventional level. This is based on social conformity, and this would be more equivalent to Piaget's moral realism, where the rules are based on what other people say, because now they at least understand that there are moral principles, but it's more about conforming to other people's approval, and they conform to avoid other people's approval or dislike. So it's more about social conformity. And this is similar to, we mentioned in the previous level, it's about like a behavioral view, but it would be more of a classical conditioning or operant conditioning, more operant conditioning, if anything. But in level 2 would be specifically social learning theory here comes into play. So there's more about observational learning, and there's reinforcement by society, essentially. So this is a social conditioning, and children are obeying simply to win the approval of others and avoid their disapproval. And so this would be similar to, again, Piaget's moral realism, and which is heteronomous morality because it's morality that's determined by other people. Then the last level, which is the post-conventional level, This is based on moral principles. So this would be more similar to moral relativism or autonomous morality, according to Piaget. But this would say that is about abiding by laws and ethical principles, which may or may not conform to society's laws. So this is not relativism necessarily. It's simply saying that there are ethical principles, and yet we have to decide how to apply those ethical principles, and that may depend a lot on the situation or the context, and sometimes how we apply those principles may not necessarily conform to other people's laws or rules. So that's why this is more relative and more autonomous. Now, there are some critics of Kohlberg's theory in that criticisms of Kohlberg's views tend to argue that his research investigates moral attitudes, but not moral behavior. So they would say that moral development is not as neatly ordered and predictable. So just because they might think a certain way doesn't necessarily mean this is how people are going to act. And perhaps the most controversial challenge is that Kohlberg's theory of morality adheres to moral absolutism, and that this says that any theory of morality that disregards cultural differences in moral beliefs is basically views that there's an absolute way of doing morality, and so Kohlberg tends to overlook the cultural aspects, which would make it more relative, which is what Piaget would say. That's why they use the term relativism. Kohlberg didn't talk so much about relativism as much as just competing ethical principles. But the culture can play a role in how those competing ethical principles are applied, which is why moral absolutism, it can be argued that this is using moral absolutism, which says that there's a right and wrong way to do things. And Kohlberg developed this theory, if you recall, from using moral dilemmas and trying to see how people would respond. But the reality is that depending on the culture, people might respond in different ways. Another challenge is that Kohlberg based his theory on interviews with only boys and men. That really limits your application or applicability of the theory. So it's only going to be applicable to men. Carol Gilligan challenged this theory on the grounds of gender bias, and she found that males and females use different criteria to make moral judgment. So she proposed that there's two types of moral reasoning. One type of morality which is based on justice, and the other which is based on caring. It reminds me in the biblical sense there's justice and then there's mercy, and I would say that's equivalent to caring. Carol Gilligan's idea that it's based on caring. And boys are trained to strive for independence, whereas girls are taught to nurture and care, and this impacts their judgments of what is right and wrong. So gender-related differences in moral perspectives begin to emerge about ages 9 to 12, which is middle childhood. And so we're going to see differences in how boys and girls judge things as morally correct or not. They use different criteria. Again, boys are focused on justice, girls are focused on caring. Okay, so in middle childhood, the peer relationships or peer groups also affect cognitive development. And friendships help children learn social concepts and social skills and to develop their self-esteem. Peers also reinforce and solidify group norms as well. And children with stable friendships have better attitudes towards school, and they achieve more. And so that's in middle childhood so that's because friendships reinforce their self-esteem. It helps them to define who they are. And yet the concept of friendship changes as a child grows. For example, in middle childhood, most children have friends of the same age and gender, Whereas as they enter adolescence, that's when they start becoming more interested in the opposite sex. Children's concept of friendship, as I mentioned, they change as they grow older, and they increasingly depend on friends to keep secrets. Although girls usually disclose more than do boys. Okay, so there are Robert Selman, who studied friendships of children aged 7 to 12. He told children stories of relationship dilemmas and then asked them questions to assess their concepts of other people, their self awareness, and their ability to reflect, their concepts of personalities, and their ideas about friendship. Selman developed 4 stages of friendship development that last from early childhood until they're about adolescence. And the first stage, if we were to summarize it, the first stage, the friends are just playmates, and they are acquaintances that come in contact with each other mainly because the parents put them in contact with each other through play dates or just whoever they are geographically closest to, essentially. And so children are more, they're not really friends as much as they are playmates, simply because they're still more egocentric and they don't really care about the perspective of others yet. However, in the second stage, awareness of another's feelings emerges. And then in the third stage, they start to develop trust. The trust develops and friends help each other. And then that's ages 9 through 12. And then in the fourth stage, which is about ages 11 through 12 and older, children can look at the relationship from another's perspective. So they can look at it objectively and observe their friendship from an outside perspective. And these are when friendships are much more stable as they enter into adolescence. Some of the criticisms of Selman's view is that in this model, the primary force behind developmental changes in friendship is the ability to understand another's perspective. However, other researchers see this process as much more complex. Peer relationships rely on self-regulatory and emotional development to a greater degree than addressed in Selman's model. So their ability to regulate their emotions and to pay attention to the emotions of others are important, not just their ability to understand another perspectives. That might help you to understand people, but that doesn't necessarily build a friendship. And Selman's model doesn't differentiate among the kinds of friendships as well. Okay, so that brings us to the next subject of going deeper into peer groups. There are also other issues that happen. Besides friendships, there's also bullies. Bullies can also appear in this time. And bullying is the repeated and intentional aggression directed by a bully against a less powerful victim. There's a common form of negative relationship. There's a common form of negative relationship between boys and girls. And it's present in every culture. And it generally peaks in middle childhood. It's interesting if you think about, why do children bully each other? I remember when I was in middle childhood, in middle school, I remember seeing bullies crop up on the buses. Kids would try to bully each other. And I think it's really because they're learning about their power, and they're still developing a sense of morality too. As we talked about morality before. They're learning about their power, and they're learning how to get what they want. And they're still developing the sense of taking on the perspective of others. So there's also a rise in physical bullying. It occurs more common among boys, but there's also a rise of cyberbullying, which can happen among both boys and girls. And 1/2 of school-age children, that's 50%, report being bullied in the past month. So bullying is a very common issue in middle childhood. So there's qualities that characterize bullies and victims, and this helps us to understand the reasons that children bully others. So there are for the reasons that contribute to bullying, these include emotional problems, like things that are happening in the family. There's youth culture, what do the peers encourage? Then sometimes they're simply just trying to have fun, and they don't understand the consequences of their behavior. Oftentimes it's about power. They're discovering their ability to have power. Maybe they're jealous of other kids and what they have. And also it's about maintaining popularity or gaining popularity. Or maybe they're jealous of somebody else's popularity. And then there is the characteristics of victims of bullying. They tend to be the weak or vulnerable ones. And this is not necessarily because they're inherently flawed, but maybe because their development is behind, and so they may be on the smaller side. Or emotionally, maybe they have lower self-esteem or self-concept because of things that have been happening in their family or prior bullying. And so they find themselves in this vicious cycle. And unfortunately, they tend to be perceived as annoying, different, and oftentimes is based on gender as well. So we mentioned the bullying between boys and girls that could take place. Okay, then there is peer groups. What is a peer group? A peer group is a group of 3 or more people of similar age who interact with each other and who share norms and goals. In their developmental trends, in early middle childhood, peer groups are informal with few operating rules and membership turnover is rapid. So it's very fluid and very flexible. They're not really rigid about it. But in middle childhood, peer groups take on greater significance. They develop a more formal structure, and their separation of the sexes especially noticeable. So boys and girls tend to associate separately, and they don't. There's not a lot of cross interaction. Girls hang out with the girls, and boys hang out with the boys. In later middle childhood, peer pressure becomes an important force, and conformity is especially important. They start to pick on each other and bully each other when there's differences, like differences in clothes, differences in shoes, and other things. There's conflicting needs of autonomy and independence with the need to belong and feel accepted. So obviously kids want to feel accepted and belong, but also they want to be independent. So the degree of conformity becomes increasingly important to children as they age. So peer groups, peer pressure becomes even more important and more stressful. And conformity can have desirable effects. It can help to encourage pro-social behavior. It helps them to develop social skills, for example. We want children to get along socially. In fact, there's some research that shows that children who are bullies early in life tend to end up being smart leaders later. And it may have something to do with that social conformity as well, and their ability to assert their power as well. So conformity to some extent can have some desirable effects. However, it can also encourage very destructive behavior as well. For example, if all the children are doing something unhealthy, maybe they're doing drugs or something like that, that would not be good. Or if they're bullying each other, then they're learning that from each other, that would not be good either. Okay, we talked before about popularity. What factors then determine popularity of school-age children? And we've talked about before about how emotional regulation plays a role. So emotional control plays an important role in popularity. But it also, as they get, other things also play a role. Their ability to do well in school, their academic performance, athletic ability is also very important. Then extreme aggressiveness, like I mentioned, bullying sometimes can actually make children appear more powerful and can contribute to this feeling of popularity. And so that's why I mentioned that there's some connection between bullying and later leadership. Not that I'm saying it's good. Obviously, we want them to learn emotional control, because that can also have a negative consequences as well if other children ostracize them and turn on them. But there's something about their ability to assert themselves. And on the other hand, extreme timidity. Oh, and that's the other thing. So extreme aggressiveness and extreme timidity can also increase their unpopularity. So if they're aggressive and they're bullies, then other children may not like that, and they may actually become unpopular. So that's not a good thing. It will actually hurt their popularity. And the same thing with timidity. If they're timid and shy, it can also make them appear unpopular as well. So it all comes down to, I really think it all comes down to how do they value themselves and project their sense of self-confidence and self-worth to other people. And children who bully others do so because oftentimes they feel insecure. So, that's going to reinforce their unpopularity as well. So I think I jumped over something. I just want to mention, going back to peer groups, we've talked about the changes in peer groups, and I want to mention that in early middle childhood, one's peer group, they tend to be more informal and quite flexible, but as they get older, they become more formal and they have more rigid membership requirements, and are usually gender segregated. So, and then as they get older, peer conformity also becomes more and more important. And so all of these contribute to, whether they conform or not is going to play a role in their sense of popularity. Now, again, if they have a good sense of their worth and self-esteem, then they might be able to resist the temptation to conform and actually establish themselves as leaders, not necessarily as followers. Okay, daycare experiences in early childhood may play a role in the link between popularity and aggressiveness. We mentioned about, their, how there's a relationship between popularity and aggressiveness. It could be too much, may not be good, but some aggressiveness may have a link. And so there was a study of early childhood care and youth development. They found that popular aggressive children spent an extensive period of early childhood in daycare. So this is interesting. There's several things that could be playing a role here. On one hand, they're learning social skills. They're learning to socialize with others early on in daycare, so they're ahead of others in some sense. But on the other hand, they don't have the family. They may have less parental involvement and self-esteem that comes from having parents involved in their lives and telling them that they are loved and valued apart from their social skills. So they learn to develop their self-esteem through their social skills apart from their parents. That would be my understanding of it. Then there's also situation-appropriate aggressiveness. This may make children in daycare popular with their peers. They learn to, when they need to be aggressive, they will. And aggressive children in daycare may be more likely to learn how to channel aggression in positive ways. So, they learn to be aggressive early on, but then they learn to channel that aggression in more constructive ways. Whereas other children who didn't develop that ability early on are learning it later. And so they may actually have less advantages with their social skills and their emotional regulation, which may make them not as popular as those who started out early. So, here's the thing. I would say that you want children to have early social skills. We want them to develop that ability to channel their aggression in positive ways, but we also don't want them to develop or to depend on aggression as a way to make them feel better. Ideally, you want to have parents involved and teaching them that their value is independent of other kids, that they are loved and worthy, and that they have a positive self-concept and self-esteem, and that they don't need to prove it through bullying and being aggressive. Unfortunately, rejection can, if they do something that's going to cause ostracization, then the rejection is going to drive them to make them feel worse about themselves. Rejected children report a higher degree of loneliness, and they have a greater tendency to blame unsatisfactory relationships on others. And children rejected by others tend to show worse academic performance as well. So that, rejection can play an important role, critical role in hurting academic performance. Going back to, we talked about the role of parents just now, but teachers also play an important role in helping children develop their self-concept. peer acceptance can also, we know that peer acceptance can be influenced by teachers' feedback, for example. Offering praise to a rejected child can change their perceptions. And teaching unpopular children more appropriate behaviors can help them to regain or redevelop their social skills so that they can become more popular. More popular children can be prompted to respond more favorably to, like, for example, if there are children who are unpopular in a class, the more popular ones can be taught how to treat the unpopular ones, and to help them build up their self-esteem. So we can lean on them and use them as to be better models in the classroom. Okay, so we talked about peer group conformity, and we've talked about rejection, but we also need to talk about the implications of identity, particularly ethnic identity and prejudice. Identity formation plays an important is related to peer group interactions because we develop our identity through our interactions with others. And we've talked about popularity, and popularity is an important dimension of personal development. But some of these things are also affected by prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is a negative attitude that's formed without adequate reason, and it's usually directed toward people because of their membership in a certain group. So think about it this way. Prejudice is an attitude, whereas discrimination is unequal treatment of others, treating others in a prejudiced manner. So prejudice is the attitude, discrimination is the behavior that is based on that prejudice. As children grow older, they become capable of thinking with greater complexity, although this does not reduce prejudice because of the increased pressure to conform. Remember, we talked about conformity. So they, if there's somebody who's different for some reason, obviously they're not going to be able to conform because maybe they look different or they have different skills or abilities. And so they're going to be treated as an outsider. Every group has the in group and the out group, and so the people who are in the out group are going to be considered outsiders, and they're going to be experience prejudice. So developing an awareness of one's ethnic identity takes place largely in middle childhood and follows a pattern dictated by the child's growing cognitive skills. So ethnic awareness begins to develop in early childhood, but it's the first step in forming ethnic identity involves learning which group one belongs to. And the second step then is learning what it means to belong to that group. And usually most of this happens during middle childhood. So they might start to develop an awareness in early childhood, but the developing awareness of their identity really takes place largely in middle childhood. Immigrant children have a particularly challenging task in forging a realistic self-identity, partly because they are typically considered outsiders. And so children who are members of distinct minority groups may encounter conflicts in maintaining their ethnic identity while also finding ways to fit into the majority culture. Like I said, they want to be accepted, they want to conform, and yet they have their unique ethnic identity. And that's also important to them. And sometimes you can't change your skin color, for example, and so you may look different. And at the same time, you still have aspects of your culture that may be different and you want to hold on to. So ethnic identity is a multifaceted, complex concept that is gradually acquired. So it starts in early childhood, but it's acquired throughout middle childhood. So as children age, they become capable of seeing people as multidimensional. They're not just one thing. They're not monolithic. It's part of their ethnic group. They're not all they're not monolithic. As children grow older, ethnic or racial similarities become an increasingly powerful basis for friendship. So people tend to gravitate toward others who have the same ethnicity or race, and or whatever we see. For example, we saw children in middle childhood tend to self-segregate based on gender, right? So they tend to associate with others of the same gender, but also others of the same ethnicity or racial group. And that's because they, according to Dr. Beverly Tatum, she said, in her book, she writes a book called "Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria?" And she says that they tend to self-segregate because it provides a safe haven where others understand what they're going through. And belonging to a group comprised of only members similar to oneself tends to improve self-esteem. If they can relate to each other, they understand that they're not abnormal and that they're normal. They find other people who get them, right? And so that helps them to boost their self-esteem. Also, socioeconomic cultures also play a role. So class differences can also play a role in how people see themselves. So people might also hang out with others of a similar class as well because they understand each other. Okay, now family we've talked a lot about peer groups, but family also continues to be the most important socializing influence for children in middle childhood. And there's continued reliance on parents and family members for support, guidance, and control. And parents and children must adapt to the child's developing abilities and preferences. All right, and so although peers become very important to children in middle childhood, the family normally continues to be the child's most important socializing force. Effective parenting in middle childhood involves subtle but effective monitoring of children's activities and behaviors. So it's important for parents to still be involved. Overall, though, the parent-child interactions always change throughout the development of a child. Children are less likely to express direct anger toward their parents. Whereas in early childhood, if they get angry, they have a meltdown and scream at their parents. But in middle childhood, that's not necessarily the case. And that's partly because they're learning discipline, probably. And yet it's still important for parents to effectively monitor their child's activities and behaviors. And so they have to be more proactive. Usually in early childhood, if the child's misbehaving, it's pretty obvious. In middle childhood, a child has to be monitored. So well-monitored children receive higher grades and are less likely to engage in delinquent behavior. We think of monitored children as a bad thing, but it's actually a good thing because it provides accountability and it helps them to succeed. Parental monitoring is more successful when the early attachment is secure. So we've talked about parenting styles. There's two dimensions of parenting style. There is warmth and control. Control is important, but you can't have control without warmth. And so you need both. Okay, there is self-regulated behavior. Self-regulated behavior is behavior that is controlled and directed by the child rather than by parents, teachers, or other external forces. Ideally, the goal is for children to achieve self-regulated behavior and where they control and direct their own behavior rather than parents telling them what to do. This is encouraged when parents reason with their children rather than making strict demands. If a parent of a middle child is continuing to demand and rely on demands to control their children, that's not a good thing because what's going to happen is when they become adolescents, they're going to rebel and they're going to do whatever they want, especially when they become adults. So it's important for parents to shift their parenting style to using more reasoning and expecting their children to comply because they want to. And so we're teaching children to self-regulate, but in the process, it's really through co-regulation. Co-regulation is involving the parents in the child's self-regulation. So they use verbal reasoning and suggestions, and they gradually increase the child's involvement in family decisions. So it's through co-regulation that parents and their children share responsibilities, which works well when parents use scaffolding techniques to lead children to develop and increase in competence. So they're slowly teaching children how to become more autonomous and to think for themselves. That's co-regulation. Okay, so we talked about peers, we talked about the influence of family. Now, it's also important to understand that the the role of the family, of the structure of the family, continues to change in our society. Uh, Parenting, for example, has changed over the past several decades in industrialized nations. We are moving away from parents who are just demanding and authoritarian, to the parents who try to be, I mean, to being parents who are authoritative, meaning that they are also warm as well as maintain control. The typical family in the mid 20th century consisted of a mother and a father and few children. So that was a nuclear family. The typical nuclear family in the U.S. had a mother, father, and a few children. However, contemporary U.S. families are a lot more varied now. We have a lot more differences in family structure. For example, the first main difference today is that now we have um, families that are headed by same-sex couples. So one of the more recent parenting models to emerge in the United States is parenting by same-sex couples or by individuals who identify as LGBT. And this is 3.5% of the adult population describes themselves as LGBT. And as many as 6 million people in the United States report having an LGBT parent. And children can be a biological offspring or they may be adopted. And biological offspring is because they may have parents who were in a mixed orientation relationship. And so maybe they were in a heterosexual relationship, but now they enter into a same-sex relationship. And so they had a child from a previous heterosexual relationship, or they were adopted. Okay, economic challenges are also associated with family structure. Most parents, and so if you look at this chart, for example, this is the percentage of married and unmarried mothers in the workforce. So on the left, you see the percentage in the labor force. So the higher number means that they are working, and so the lower number means not. So those who have children under 18 at home still, the ones who are married, both married or not, tend to be working. Those who have children under age of 3, less so. But even still, the majority of parents, mothers, are still working. So this is, mothers, either married or unmarried, are working, the majority of them. And whether or not they are married. And they may be less inclined to do so with young children, but even still, many of them work in order to maintain the family, to provide, especially in a more challenging economy. It's required that in order to survive in this economy, most parents of school-age children work outside the home. And so that's going to put some impact on how parents care for their children and how much time they can commit. And families that are headed by single parents are especially vulnerable to economic challenges because they often lack social support and economic resources. In this chart, we can see still that U.S. single parents, there's, like, for example, there's still a vast majority of single parents who work. Now, single mothers are less likely to be employed in 2011, but still the majority are. Fathers are more likely, but still the majority are working. And this can, like I said, families of single parents often require their parents to work, the single parent to work, because they don't have as much resources. They don't have as much financial resources. And so we talked about even when they're married, they're working, but it's especially important for single parents because they don't have any other financial support. And most parents of school-age children work outside the home. And it's viewed as a norm now. Children of working parents are insightful and accepting of their parents' busy lives, and even children who feel their parents balance work and family life well report parents are stressed. And that's because there is a family work balance that has to be maintained still. And so oftentimes when both parents are working, they can bring their stress home and it can affect the family. So let's talk about stress. When stress is chronic and extreme, children and adults develop symptoms such as nightmares, fearfulness, depression, anxiety, trouble with concentration, aggressive behavior, or blunted emotions. A research indicates children who grow up in cultures of violence often engage in aggressive play, have nightmares, or are troubled by sudden memories that intrude. And young children who live in constant violence, who live with constant violence in their communities, are often fearful, depressed, and anxious. So children, their ability to manage stress involves several factors, which we're going to look at when we talk about resilience. But stress is better dealt with when stressful events do not pile up, when children understand the events and know what to expect, and when parents and social support are also available. Unfortunately, when parents are stressed out, they often use less effective parenting techniques. Therefore, the development of their children may be affected. And social support and setting clear rules and expectations for children can help parents deal more effectively with stress. Unfortunately, if the children are acting out, if they're misbehaving, that can actually create more stress for the parents, which can create more stress for the children as well. So it's very important to help parents to learn how to manage their children effectively, because that can reduce stress for them as well. Resilient children are children who are able to overcome difficult environments to lead socially competent lives. So we want resilient children who know how to manage stress. And that starts with the parents who know how to manage stress. And they teach their children how to manage it. Otherwise, if the parents are overwhelmed, then the children are going to also be overwhelmed. In 2014, 68% of children lived in two-parent homes. 24%, a quarter of them, lived only with their mother. And 4% lived with their fathers. And 4% lived with neither parent. Stress is a concern associated particularly with single-parent households because, as we mentioned, there's financial challenges. Economic challenges for single-parent households are greater than those of two-parent households. Because, think about it, even two-parent households have to have parents at work because of the economic challenges. And yet, if you have a single parent, it's even more so. I can't imagine how they do it. I'm thankful that, for myself, both my wife and I work. I can't imagine how a single parent manages. Okay, so the economic hardships take a toll on the mother's psychological functioning. Depressed mothers tend to punish their children more frequently, which creates, more problems for them. Most children who grow up in single parent families are, for the most part, they're well adjusted and successful. So we don't want to think that they're going to be bad. For the most part, they do a good job considering their circumstances, but they may have more challenges. Girls especially benefit from having mothers who are employed too. There's many factors for that. Having finances helps encourage, the mother. It helps the children to be protected when they are financially sound. And also having other interactions for the mother helps the mother feel like she's got other social support and she's got other resources she can turn to, which helps girls who may be vulnerable. So we saw how single parent families, they can still survive. They can still do well, but they definitely have a lot of financial challenges. But children of divorce tend to be vulnerable a lot to the trauma of a divorce. 40% of all U.S. marriages are expected to end in divorce. It's a lot of divorces in our country. And children typically feel a sense of loss. Divorce is very traumatic for children when parents' hostility is high. And so here's some factors that may affect their reaction to divorce. The amount of hostility between the parents accompanying the divorce that can affect the trauma that the children face. Also, when it involves major changes to their home life, and when the parents fail to stay emotionally involved with and attached to their children. Like for example, when my parents divorced, my father stopped coming around, mainly because he didn't want to be around my mom, probably, or she didn't want him around. But the problem is that um, then I felt like my dad didn't care about me. It may not be about me, but children don't know any better. They personalize it and they make it about themselves. And so if the parents are not still emotionally involved with the children, that's going to feel devastating and it's going to hurt their self-esteem. Ideally, even when parents are divorced, they still need to be involved in their children's lives because their children still need them. It's so very important to remember that. Now, children are going to have difficulty adjusting to divorce. When parents divorce, children often experience adjustment problems such as behavioral difficulties, anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, and they often have more problems with school. So they will frequently test the rules. They may have experienced few negative long-term effects, which is good, but some children of divorced parents report higher incidences of anxiety and depression. They probably had a lot of trauma in their family, lots of conflict, and they didn't know how to respond. Divorcing parents can help the children adjust by setting clear limits and sticking as much to familiar routines as possible. Even when they have to move, it's best to try and maintain routines because it helps provide a sense of security for the children. And also, don't badmouth the other partner. That's not good for the children either. It's important to maintain, diminish the hostility because the hostility can traumatize the children. So when they remarry, this is known as a reconstituted family. So the reconstituted family, also known as a step family, is a family where a mother or father with children has remarried to produce a new family. And when they remarry, children are affected. When a mother or father, this is also known as a step family. Children, unfortunately, in these circumstances, may feel divided loyalties, and because they want to be loyal to their biological parent, but they're also loyal to the other parent, who's now the ex. And so they may not like the new step parent. In fact, they may resent being disciplined by the step parent. They may say, "You don't have a right to tell me what to do. I'm going to talk to my mom or my dad, the biological parent." And so the step parent may feel this resentment. And unfortunately, oftentimes, for young children, the remarriage may dash their hopes for reconciliation, however unrealistic those hopes may be. And so, as I said, there may be issues involving discipline by the step parent or sharing with other new family members. For example, they may feel left out of the new family. Maybe there's this new step parent has other kids, and that step parent wants to do stuff with their kids, but they may feel left out or less than the step siblings. And the most issues stemming from divorce and reconstituted families are short-lived, with no long-term negative effects. At least that's what the research shows. The real issue, as I said before, really has a lot to do with how do the parents relate to their children. If the parents stop relating to the children or they pull away, that's where the problem happens. It's important for the parents to still maintain a connection. And unfortunately, oftentimes the parents pull away because of the divorce. So it's not so much the divorce that plays a role as much as how does the divorce affect the structure of the family and how does it affect the relationship between the parents and the children. Thankfully, most children are resilient and they learn how to cope successfully with stress. Okay, so that's basically it. And let's just recap. We've talked about personality development. We've looked at how their self-concept becomes more stable, realistic, and accurate in middle childhood. We looked at Erik Erikson's stage of industry versus inferiority. We said that self-esteem reflects a child's positive or negative evaluations of themselves. We've also talked about how development of self-esteem is a reciprocal process. So if they see themselves poorly, other people are going to treat them that way. We've also talked about social cognition, how it's developed through interactions with other people, and how these are how children learn social inferences, which is assumptions about other people. They learn their responsibilities and social regulations or social norms. We also looked at morality, the development of morality. We looked at the stages of moral realism and moral relativism. We also looked at pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional and how they're similar to moral realism and moral relativism. We also looked at how moral dilemmas and I don't know if you recall that, but we looked at how Kohlberg used moral dilemmas to develop the theory of stages. But one of the criticisms of that is that this talks more about attitudes and not necessarily about their behavior. And one of the challenges of the models had to do with moral absolutism, this idea that there's only one right way of doing things, and that culture may affect how people think of things as morally right or wrong. And not just culture, but also our gender as well. We looked at, for example, boys view morality based on justice and girls view morality based on caring. We've also talked about peer relationships, how friends of middle childhood tend to be of the same gender and also the same ethnic group. We've also talked about stages of friendship. They start out based on as playmates, but then they start to learn about each other's feelings, and they start to develop friendships that are more deeper. We also saw how peer groups start out more informally, but then they become more structured and more formal. And as you get into high school and adolescence, they start to even have identity labels for themselves as well. But peer groups tend to be exclusive. For example, boys and girls are segregated in middle childhood, and also among ethnic lines as well. In middle childhood, they tend to be. You see ethnic prejudices appear in your middle childhood. Then, unfortunately, conformity also is strong during this age, and especially in adolescence as well. But conformity has good and bad sides. Conformity can teach them about social skills, and it can help them to learn how to be popular or not. But the downside is that, they may need to learn how to empathize with others. And that's why it's also important to learn about. They also learn about morality and thinking ethically. We've also talked about the difference between prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is an attitude. Discrimination is the behavior that results from it. We've also talked about developing awareness of one's ethnicity. Largely takes place in middle childhood. It starts in early childhood, but it really is clarified during middle childhood. Minority children may encounter conflicts maintaining their ethnic identity while trying to fit into and conform with the majority culture. We've also looked at the important role that family plays in middle childhood. Parents still have a primary role in child development. In particular, parents teach children how to self-regulate their emotions and their behavior. If parents are stressed out, their children are going to be stressed out. And single parents are especially vulnerable to stress because of the finances and the difficulty having social support and resources to help them. And 40% of all U.S. marriages end in divorce, which means there's a lot of families that are reconstituted or blended families or step families. And there's some unique challenges that are there. For example, children of blended families have to have divided loyalties, or they may feel left out if there's other step siblings. And that's it. Thank you for listening, and have a good day.